Hi all, I thought I'd do a little video or presentation on concurrent training, which is the ability to develop strength and endurance simultaneously. So something that comes up quite often clinically, and I talk a lot about on my workshops. This is our roadrunner guy here. Look at him, he's looking incredibly hench, which is what I think the kids call muscly nowadays. Like I say, concurrent training comes up a lot on my workshop, my strength and conditioning workshop for runners, and I always completely brush over it and encourage people to go away and read this paper that's listed here by Wilson in 2012 if they're interested further. But I thought it'd be a good opportunity whilst we're all in lockdown to look a little bit into what I mean. I try really hard on my workshops and in my clinics and in my presentations, my webinars, to make things as simplistic as possible, to not get too entrenched in the science. But this is, like I said, I thought a nice opportunity to have a look at the science and see exactly why concurrent training is an important consideration. So as we say, concurrent training is essentially the ability to develop strength and endurance simultaneously. Is it possible? Can we do it? What are the limitations? We have to talk about something called the interference effect, which is essentially endurance training interferes with resistance exercise, so strength training, via residual fatigue and substrate depletion, leading to a blunting of muscular development. And in this case, when we talk about strength training, we're generally talking about high intensity, low volume, and endurance training, the opposite. Generally speaking, endurance training would be considered low intensity, high volume. So lots of considerations with the interference effect. The interference effect seems to work by an alteration in neural recruitment pattern of skeletal muscle. It limits force generation. There seems to be an increased neuromuscular fatigue from demands of the high volume of the endurance training, which makes sense. Muscle glycogen depletion, leading to this downregulation of protein accretion and reducing training performance, which would lead to an increase in catabolic hormones, which we're going to talk about in a second. So there's this likely testosterone and cortisol battle that goes on. There's an interference there due to the increased catabolic state, leading to this reduced change in cross-sectional area of the muscle. And the endurance training may decrease muscle fiber due to it to enable increases in capillary and mitochondrial density, which again makes sense because we want our capillaries to be increasing to enable oxygen and energy and efficiency for running or endurance events. This is the paper that I always allude to on my workshop, the concurrent training and meta-analysis examining interference of aerobic and resistance exercise by Wilson in 2012, which essentially concludes that whilst muscular power does increase, it's significantly lower in concurrent training groups compared to strength only. So those that are training endurance and strength have a lower strength benefit than those trained in strength only, which is also supported from a paper from 1980, so a long time ago, where we can see S on this graph is strength only, and over this 10-week course you can see they make a consistent improvement over their training. So week 1 all the way through to week 10, they're making increasing progress with their strength training. Opposite end of the spectrum, we've got our endurance guys. Those carrying out just endurance had a slight increase in strength, but overall not a huge jump in strength by just endurance training of 10 weeks. And then the interesting group for us is the strength and endurance group, which we can see for the first 7 weeks make good progress. First, 4 or 5 weeks, they're almost linear with the strength alone group. Starts to plateau up to about week 7. They're making an increase. 7 to 8 seems to plateau, and then interestingly, weeks 9 to 10, the strength comes down. So there's an actual decrease in training for those doing the concurrent training program. So again, it gets a bit sciencey here, but I'll try and make it as simple as possible. So post and during endurance training, we have these metabolic signaling pathways, which are linked to substrate depletion and calcium release and our ability to use the calcium, and then a secondary messenger called adenosine monophosphate activated kinase, AMPK. These are activated during and post endurance training. In turn, this inhibits the mediation of a skeletal muscle hypertrophy or building muscle by upregulating protein synthesis, which is done by this pathway, which is called the mammalian target of rapamycin, or mTOR. Very sciencey. In short, we can make an assumption there's a very, very basic equation that I've probably simplified here of low glycogen plus high calcium plus an increased adenosine monophosphate, which is through this AMPK pathway, will result in a reduced protein accretion. So a lack of ability to use the protein, which again is through this pathway, the mTOR pathway that we've just looked at. So strength training as a consideration in a fasted or a fatigue state may not be best practice, is what we can surmise from that. We say very sciencey, we don't need to get bogged down in it too much, but those are the molecular signaling pathways that underlie interference training or concurrent training. So things to consider for us as a training order. Overall research suggests that strength training has minimal effect on cardiovascular performance. So strength training doesn't seem to affect runners per se. But conversely, endurance training may inhibit strength training. So if you're someone in the gym looking to get big and strong and doing cardio, there seems to be more of an effect for you guys than there is for the runners doing their strength training. An interesting strength and power adaptation was inhibited for at least 6 hours post-session. And these are sessions where strength followed endurance. And fairly obvious statement, 24-hour recovery had better results than 6 hours. But ultimately, we don't know if there's a beneficial training order. Again, more considerations, very wordy slides, but lots of weightlifters and bodybuilders particularly will do this, or even regular gym girls will do this already, but consider split training routines where upper body and lower body are carried out on alternate days. But for the endurance athletes, you could consider a split training routine where upper body is carried out on aerobic, which are predominantly leg-based days. So if you're doing strength training and endurance training on the same day, consider upper body days on your running days, because we know that hypertrophy has less interference during those concurrent training programs. You could consider other forms of endurance training. For example, we know cycling has been shown to have less interference effect with strength training, which we think is due to the lower muscle damage caused by cycling compared to running. If you are same-day training, consider strength training at least 6 hours after endurance. There's an interesting paper by Teo et al. In 2011, which suggests 4 p.m. Being our optimal time to train due to circadian rhythm, which is a paper that looks at a lot of hormonal changes. I would say there's limits to that if you are a shift worker, for example. So 4 p.m. Would be optimal if you're someone getting up at 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, for example. But we seem to see that strength levels are at their highest in the evening. And again, it allows for, we were talking just briefly on the mTOR pathway, it allows for elevation of the pathway, which facilitates more protein synthesis. And of course, if you're doing it in the evening, presumably you're going to go to bed, which, as we all know, is ideal for recovery, which we'll look at in a second. So this correlates with a paper by Barr in 2014, where signaling pathways activated by endurance training have been found to return to base levels after 3 hours, whereas anabolic response after strength training lasts at least 18 hours. So again, that would certainly fit the ideal of endurance training before strength training. However, strength training in the morning produces a priming effect, which results in improved physical performance 6 hours later. So ultimately, we don't know. There's lots and lots of variations on the research. I'm claiming that comment at the bottom. Recover as hard as you train is the most important thing. Regardless of whether you're training every 6 hours or 24 hours, we need to make sure that we're doing all we can to recover to be ready for the next session. I did a full... I did a 25 minute webinar on recovery a few weeks ago, which is available on my YouTube channel. So I won't go into that too much, but that's a general kind of overview of what we spoke about. Like I say, I recommend you go and watch that on the YouTube channel. So to summarise, and again, I know it's fairly sciencey and chemically and molecularly and all those made up words. There's lots of variables which make the research really hard. So it has to be goal orientated to the person. Do you want to get big and strong? Do you want to get strong and fast as an endurance athlete? Your training program should be relative to your goals. Overall, research seems to suggest that interference effect has greatest effect on strength development over endurance development, and this is most likely because of molecular signaling activation from the type of training, which again we touched on. You can go back and listen to this if you're interested in those kinds of things. Most consistent findings suggest 24 hours between strength endurance sessions. Where this is not possible, 6 to 8 should be sufficient. CrossFitters are an interesting group. I work with a lot of CrossFitters. I love my CrossFit. I'm a big fan. And so they fit into almost a subsection of interference training, whereas they are not doing true endurance events. They're doing more high intensity events coupled with strength training. But ultimately, again, we don't know as much as we would like at this stage. That the research is variable. So I don't know if it was useful, but hopefully it was a little bit. There was a little bit of interest there for people to see the whys of how we work and how we structure our training programs or our strength up programs or our recovery programs. If anyone has any questions or anything to add, these are all the ways you can contact me. And yeah, hope you're all keeping well.